The Colosseum, stage for the most cruel and violent games the world has ever seen. In this giant arena, 6,000 animals were slain on the opening day alone. Hundreds of thousands of gladiators, criminals and Christians died here in the name of popular entertainment. A roll call of brutality that lasted 400 years, played out to an audience of millions. It is a building dedicated to the spectacle of death. In the bloody history of humanity, it has no equal.
What can I say about that dreadful place, the amphitheater? It is the temple of all demons. There are as many unclean spirits there as it can seat men.
When I began my research for the movie, what most impressed me about the Colosseum was that it was one of the great monuments of mankind. And unlike any other monument of mankind, it was the one dedicated to death. Entertainment and death, which seemed like an odd couple.
Although it was the place where people were killed, where animals were slaughtered, where criminals were executed, for me it still stands as a symbol of Roman power and dominance, of Roman civilization in all its awfulness and in all its strength.
The Colosseum was built to reassert the power and glory of Rome at a time when the empire's very survival was being threatened. In 64 AD, Emperor Nero ruled over a vast domain that stretched from Britain in the west to Jerusalem in the east. Rome was the greatest power the Western world had ever known. And yet it was being destroyed from within by Nero himself, whose lust for power was matched only by his paranoia. His rivals were removed without mercy, including his mother and 22-year-old wife Octavia. And when Rome was ravaged by fire, he made Christians his scapegoats. On Nero's orders, they were rounded up, crucified, and set alight as human torches. Rumors that Nero had started the fire himself gained credence when he seized 200 acres of the burnt-out city and built upon their ruins his golden house, a new imperial palace with a vast ornamental lake and a colossal statue of Nero himself. This self-indulgent act proved to be his undoing. The army rebelled, and the Senate condemned Nero to death. Hunted down like a common criminal, Nero ordered his valet to kill him. With the emperor dead, a bloody struggle for power began. That year, 69 AD, became known as the Year of 4 Emperors, as successive regimes were swept aside in a tide of death and destruction. Out of the chaos emerged one true leader, General Titus Flavius Vespasian. The Flavian dynasty was born, and with it, a fragile peace. But Vespasian still needed the support of the Roman masses if his dynasty was to survive. In an extravagant public relations exercise, he set out to build the grandest and most elaborate amphitheater the empire had ever seen. The Colosseum was a direct appeal to the hearts and minds of a people whose culture was steeped in the codes of combat and death.
Rome is a warrior society. Rome conquered the whole of the Mediterranean basin. It did it by being cruel, by destroying everything in its path. When the Romans captured a town, they killed everybody, all animals. They were the masters of the world. And you don't rule the world with cups of tea or only as a veneer. Underneath the civilization. There was cruelty, there was power, and the games represent that power mode.
The origin of the games can be dated back to the 3rd century BC, when they took the form of an elaborate burial ritual.
In the beginning, gladiatorial fights were part of a human sacrifice that took place by the tomb of a distinguished dead person. And they began very small. The first fight we know of in the 3rd century BC was 3 pairs of gladiators fighting. It then became a ritual associated with death.
Looking back from the 2nd century AD, the Carthaginian lawyer Tertullian wrote,
The ancients thought that with this kind of spectacle they rendered a service to the dead, believing that the souls of the dead are appeased with human blood. So they found comfort for death in murder.
From these modest beginnings, gladiatorial combat developed into a public spectacle. Today the violence of those games appalls, but to the Roman citizen, violence was a daily fact of life.
Death is endemic to a pre-industrial society. Life expectation was short. 50% of children born would die before the age of 5. When you entered a Roman city, when you entered Rome, you would see burial tombs on either side of the street. You would smell corpses burning. So death was pervasive.
In this tough environment, pleasures were few and civil unrest common. Mob violence threatened Rome's stability, and her rulers learnt to appease the plebs with subsidized food and free gladiatorial games, bread and circuses. The bread was paid for out of the public purse. The circuses were gifts from an emperor to his people.
The gladiator sports were intertwined with politics. A senator who was running for office, if he threw great games, had a much better chance of being elected than someone who, made speeches, for instance.
No emperor would ever make such a dramatic and generous gift as Vespasian made with the Colosseum. It would be built entirely at his own expense. Within its walls, the whole array of nature conquered by the empire would be displayed to its citizens free of charge.
By choosing to put the Colosseum on top of the Lake of Nero's Golden House, Vespasian was making a very specific statement. The lake represented the abuse of personal power that caused Nero's downfall.
The Colosseum would physically erase the lake from Rome's landscape and history. Nero's pleasure palace, a symbol of corruption and indulgence, would be replaced by a people's palace of matching extravagance.
I always like to think of the Colosseum as a sort of super stadium. After all, we think that the Colosseum could perhaps provide places for 70,000 spectators. But it is significantly larger than any other known amphitheatre. And I think that is symbolic. Rome is the greatest city in the greatest empire. Its amphitheatre has to be the greatest.
The Colosseum would be the largest freestanding structure built in Rome. It would also be built with greater speed than any other imperial project. The reason for this urgency was simple. Vespasian was already 60. Above all else, he wanted to bask in the glory of the Colosseum's grand opening before he died. Even for a society built on slave labor and dictatorial power, building the Colosseum to this deadline would stretch the manpower and resources of Rome to its limits. Of the 100,000 slaves Vespasian brought back from his conquest of Jerusalem in 70 AD, 30,000 were dedicated to the building works. In addition to the workforce of slaves, the cream of Rome's craftsmen were drafted onto the project. Every detail of the construction was planned with military precision.
Romans used their organisational powers that come out so clearly in things like Roman law and particularly in the Roman army to marshal labour into reasonable sized groups and make them all work together. So it's quite likely that the actual labour comes from the hundreds, not thousands of small building firms around the city who could be organised in this sort of almost paramilitary way.
Construction was divided between 4 teams, each tackling a quarter of the structure. The building would be constructed around a network of solid stone piers, arranged in 7 concentric rings. Each ring contained 80 pillars, and on this load-bearing skeleton of stone, the rest of the Colosseum would be built. Vaults and arches linked the stone piers together, forming the elaborate network of stairs and walkways. The Colosseum's massive stone piers are made from travertine, a sedimentary rock of great strength. It is still quarried today in the hills of Tivoli, 17 miles from the centre of Rome. Great slabs of stone are prized from the bedrock. A steel sack that expands when filled with water is positioned between the rock faces. As the sack expands, the cut section is forced away. To achieve the same effect, the Romans filled their vertical incisions with dried wood, which they then soaked with water. As the wood expanded, the rock faces separated. To build the Colosseum, the quarries of Tivoli produced over 500,000 tons of travertine.
The calculations suggest you need something in the order of 100,000 cubic metres. Now that's an unimaginable sum, but if you turn this into feet and think of a block a foot by a foot by a foot, and you strung these cubic feet of blocks of travertine out in a straight line, they'd stretch for 700 miles.
In addition, 150,000 tons of the best marble were imported to Rome, either by ship along the river Tiber or by ox carts. 200 ox carts arrived at the construction site every day.
You can imagine a whole string of ox carts, nose to tail. Even if you average these 100,000 cubic metres of stone over the 8 years it took to build, you'd still need an ox cart to leave every 7 minutes. One of the most difficult things about building the Colosseum must have been raising these large blocks of travertine for the facade, which after all is 50 metres high. And Romans used cranes, treadmill cranes, that is actually operated by manpower. So you have to imagine that the Colosseum is a building site with perhaps a dozen of these massive circular treadmills in operation all at the same time, raising these huge blocks of stone.
The stones were locked together by internal metal clamps. Shaped like spears, the clamps slotted into pre-drilled holes. A channel was then cut downwards along the join, and molten lead was poured into the cavity, creating a perfect seal for added strength and protection from corrosion. A thin layer of chalk mortar completed the join between the travertine blocks.
Dunque l'arco e la volta sono elementi strutturali dominanti.
The vaults and arches between the travertine are the dominant structural feature in the monument. These skills were inherited from the Greeks and then developed by the Romans, using new materials like concrete.
The development of concrete by Roman builders was a breakthrough technology. It enabled them to build arches of greater strength and size than had been previously possible. The concrete used in the Colosseum has an added special ingredient. In addition to the combination of lime, rock fragment and sand, it contains pozzolana, a red volcanic dust from Vesuvius. This unique material gives the concrete of the Colosseum phenomenal strength and durability.
Now, Roman concrete is a very special and rather remarkable material. It develops its strength very quickly, it will set under water, it's hydraulic, and it also develops its strength over a long period of time. In fact, it's one of the strongest man-made materials that we have that has a proven life, quite clearly, at least 2,000 years. Because of this, it was actually tested in the early 80s for nuclear waste disposal.
When Rome finally fell in 410 AD, the secrets of concrete production died with the empire. They were not rediscovered until the Renaissance. The building of the Colosseum progressed upwards in tiers, with each tier built in progressively lighter materials. Brickwork became increasingly important, and here again, Roman technological prowess gave the builders of the Colosseum a huge advantage. In Lombardy, craftsmen are making bricks using the same methods as the builders of the Colosseum. Before Nero's reign, Roman bricks were hardened in the open air. This limited their load-bearing properties. As a result, brick buildings were restricted to single-story structures. It was not until manufacturers started firing bricks in kilns that their true potential was revealed. When clay is heated to a high and constant temperature, all moisture is driven from it. The water is replaced by gases that further harden the baked clay and cause natural pores in the material to contract, greatly increasing a brick's resistance to water and erosion. For Vespasian's engineers, the fired brick enabled them to build higher than ever before. By 79 AD, the first two tiers of the Colosseum were complete. Vespasian, his health failing, pushed his builders harder still. More slaves were bought, more labor conscripted. But to no avail. Vespasian died before the Colosseum's inaugural games. That honor would fall to his eldest son, Titus. The scale and lavishness of Titus's opening games would astound the Roman world. Like his father before him, Titus made the completion of the Colosseum a priority. In less than a year, he had finished almost all the structural work. In 80 AD, he could wait no longer. Though the Colosseum was far from complete, Titus decreed that the opening games should commence. By now, the building covered 6 acres of land and measured 620 feet by 510. Its impact was enormous.
We have from the poet Martial, who was present when the Colosseum was open, a really interesting statement of how this building was perceived. He likens it to the canonical wonders of the world, the pyramids of Egypt, for example, and says not only is this another wonder of the world, but it is the wonder to supersede all the other wonders put together. It is going to be the 8th and final and greatest wonder of the world.
Titus, the newly crowned emperor, took every advantage of the Colosseum's glamour. He proclaimed the opening a public holiday. Posters boasted that the inaugural games, scheduled to last 100 days without interruption, would be the greatest ever staged. 9,000 animals from every corner of the empire were slaughtered in staged battles. Criminals were publicly executed. 3,000 gladiators battled to the death. Women gladiators fought as a novelty to amuse the crowd. All this in the first days alone. To witness this carnage, tickets of bone were distributed to the public free of charge. Each ticket indicated which of the 76 entrances was to be used. These wide, steep staircases were called vomitoria. In an emergency, they could spew out the entire audience in under 5 minutes. They also allowed soldiers to reach any part of the arena in seconds if crowd trouble flared up.
I think the Colosseum must have looked completely magnificent. It was a huge building by Roman standards. You go inside and the noise, the crowd's roar, must have been quite staggering. For Romans, this was the only place in which you could see so many people gathered together. It must have been a fantastic experience, one which was obligatory for people to go to as often as they could.
6 entrances were reserved for the Roman elite. They led into the arena's most opulent rooms. The floors were polished travertine, the walls faced with the best Carrara marble, every arch decorated with painted stucco, while perfume was sprayed throughout to sweeten the stench of death. But even in the public areas, the decorations were ornate, with bronze statues of heroes and gods lining the walkways. Drinking fountains were placed throughout to quench the crowd's thirst, the wastewater running along open channels to help cool the walkways. The seating was arranged in a rigid hierarchy. The closer to the killing you were, the higher your status. The worst seats in the house were reserved for women. Next came slaves, the poor, and freedmen. Next level down was reserved for soldiers and ordinary citizens. Below them, officers and middle-ranking civil servants. Ringside seats were reserved for senators and their guests. The only women permitted ringside were the Vestal Virgins, a female priesthood whose cult expressed and guaranteed the prosperity of Rome. The grandest seats of all were for the emperor and his entourage. Front row and center stage, they were quite simply the best seats in the house.
The games were political theatre. It was the stage on which the emperor could appear before the Roman populace, 50,000 citizens collected together in the Colosseum. So it was quite carefully stage managed. You have to imagine an entry in which, first of all, there's silent, harsh expectation, trumpets, water organ, music, and then the emperor enters. And then there's a sacrifice, there's religious procession, and imagine when a gladiatorial fight comes to an end, everyone yells either let the guy go, let the guy be killed, and only the emperor can decide. And so the emperor signals thumbs up, thumbs down, but everyone's eyes are on the emperor. And at that moment, the emperor knows that he is the ruler of Rome, of the world.
As ruler of the Roman world, Titus was expected to deliver spectacles of a scale and imagination never seen before. He did not fail his subjects. On the 3rd day of the Games, the Colosseum was filled with water, and a naval battle between miniature warships took place to the delight of the crowd. How Roman engineers managed this feat has puzzled historians for centuries, so much so that the flooding has been dismissed by many as a myth. But the latest archaeological excavations prove that it was possible to stage naval battles inside the arena.
Our research tells us that in the reign of Titus, it was possible to fill the Colosseum with water for the opening games. The water probably came from the nearby Aqua Claudia viaduct. That aqueduct was large, and it would have been possible to fill the arena with water in a short time. From what is known today, we can tell that the water level couldn't have been very high, probably between 80 centimeters to 1 meter. Otherwise, all the other service rooms would have been flooded.
Like gladiatorial fights, naval battles were fought to the death. As an added treat for the audience, crocodiles were released into the flooded arena. But the spectacle of naval battles was short-lived. Within a year of opening the Colosseum, Titus was dead. He was succeeded by his brother, Domitian, under whose patronage the Colosseum would finally be completed. Like his brother and father before him, Domitian was determined to leave his own mark on the culture of the games. To do so, he would transform the Colosseum in the pursuit of ever more elaborate entertainments. When Domitian came to power in 81 AD, the Colosseum had been open for over 2 years, yet it was still incomplete. Domitian ordered his engineers to dig deep into the substructures of the arena. The flooding mechanisms would be sacrificed. In their place would be built a subterranean complex of lifts, trapdoors, and service corridors. The stage machinery needed to transform the games into special effects spectaculars.
When I was first down there, I had read about everything that had gone on. The animal cages, the animal handlers, the people who had trained animals, the armorers, and everything. And you can imagine trying to coordinate everything you needed in one day's activity so the games would flow seamlessly from one event to the other. Far more difficult than an average sporting event today. I mean, a football game, nothing. Forget about it.
Domitian's architects created 3 levels of passages beneath the Colosseum. Hundreds of men and women labored here in appalling conditions to stage the games.
When we look at the substructure today, we can barely imagine how it might have looked here at the time of the games. First of all, we have to assume that there had been a lot of mechanical installations and that all the corridors were crammed with machinery. Further, we have to imagine that it would have been very dark, as the only light sources were either oil lamps or torches. On top of that, you had the noise of the lifts, the roaring of the animals, and of course the shouting from the arena itself.
Choreographing the movement of thousands of animals, gladiators, and tons of stage scenery was a huge challenge. With the emperor's reputation at stake, only a perfect performance was acceptable. The price of failure was terrifyingly high.
In one instance, the backstage work was carried out so awkwardly during one of the maneuvers that the emperor convicted them to appear in the arena afterwards themselves, where they were ripped apart by wild animals.
At the heart of the Colosseum's special effects were 32 elevators that lifted wild beasts, scenery, and gladiators into the center of the arena. Driven by manpower and counterweights, the elevators were at the very heart of the Colosseum's theater of death. 256 men were needed to operate the lifting mechanisms.
In this corridor, a lift system was located. We can tell from this block. It held a large mast for a hoist. Around the hoist was a system of ropes to lift up the elevators.
The channels that guided the elevator to the floor of the Colosseum can be clearly seen. The tunnels of the substructure total over a mile in length, with 32 holding pens that could process thousands of animals a day. The animals destined for slaughter were driven down tunnels too narrow for them to turn around in. With no escape, they were forced into the open cages. As the door crashed behind them, the animal was hoisted up. Scared, hungry, and confused, the beast would head instinctively for the light, straight into the heart of the Colosseum and certain death. The elevators were so efficient that on one occasion, 32 lions were delivered into the arena at once. Their collective roar so loud it silenced the crowd. The games had never been more elaborate, but still Domitian was not satisfied. His other great innovation was the installation of the velarium, a giant retractable awning that protected the Roman crowd from the intense heat of summer. The velarium is an engineering masterpiece in its own right. The canopy was suspended over a complex network of rigging, which in turn was anchored by 240 masts that encircle the uppermost tier of the building. Ropes ran down from the top masts to capstans at pavement level. To raise or lower the velarium, they had to be winched in perfect unison. Marshalled by beating drums, the giant awning would be inched into position. Whenever it was periodically lowered and raised, at least 1,000 men would have been needed.
The velarium, we are told by Pliny the Elder, was a very thin sheet of silk, which was also embroidered with gold stars. So the scenic effect with the glint of the sun must have been extremely beautiful.
The velarium was the Colosseum's crowning glory. With its installation, the building was finally complete, only 12 years after the first stone had been laid. In that time, the Colosseum had become Rome's main attraction. A typical day started with the display of wild beasts brought from all over the empire.
Romans had the image to themselves that they were masters of the world. And one of the ways in which they could demonstrate their mastery of the world was to bring the most exotic creatures they could find, bring them to Rome and to exhibit them. We truly are the masters of the world. So they brought giraffes, leopards, lions, bears, ostriches, hippopotamuses, rhinoceroses, everything. But the Romans, instead of idly watching the animals in captivity, brought them into the arena and killed them. Different culture, different practices.
This slaughter was not simply bloodlust. To a Roman citizen, it was a demonstration of the empire's domination over uncivilized nature.
The central moment of Roman ritual life is the sacrifice of an animal. To worship a god, you sacrifice an animal. You kill the animal, you slit its throat. So seeing a bull, a pig, a lamb, a chicken killed was, for Roman, the central point of religious service. I think the sacrifices of animals or of humans in the Colosseum was carrying that religious symbolism just one step further.
Following the animal show came the public executions of criminals. The condemned's position in society dictated how they were to die. Slaves and common criminals were crucified, some set alight as they writhed upon the cross. Most criminals were thrown to the lions and torn to death to the crowd's delight. The animals were not always willing executioners. Terrified by the baying crowd and weak from maltreatment, they needed extra incentives for attack. Underground, stagehands daubed the condemned with fresh blood in order to drive the beasts into a feeding frenzy. Prisoners were even tied to a stake and pushed onto cornered animals to guarantee their mauling.
In the center of the day, sometimes there were not only executions just killing people, but there were dramatic reenactments of myths. So that, or sexual plays in which animals were said to have intercourse with convicted criminals. But say, the end, the denouement of the myth was the criminal was cruelly executed, covered with a cape soaked in pitch and set alight for the enjoyment and pleasure of the crowd.
Yet all this bloodshed was simply the appetizer for the main event. The gladiators, the superstars of the Colosseum, its champions of death. Gladiatorial combat was the Colosseum's main attraction, the highlight of a day's sport. The demand for gladiatorial fights was so great, a whole industry was developed to train up and equip a constant supply of fighters for the games. The Colosseum supported 4 gladiatorial schools, a combination of training camps and prisons, as the majority of fighters were slaves or prisoners of war. At full capacity, they housed 2,000 gladiators, drawn from all over the empire. Underground tunnels led directly into the subterranean labyrinth of the arena. The only means of escape was through victory or death. Training schools developed under the guidance of Lannistai, former gladiators who had fought and survived for more than 3 years. It was their job to make sure that the fighters reached the arena in peak condition. With such highly trained warriors, a typical training session could develop into a brawl where personal scores were settled. At times like this, the tutor would have to stamp his authority. Female fighters were also popular with Roman audiences. Emperors Domitian and Commodus delighted in watching women fight to the death. A novice fighter started his training using a blunt wooden sword called a rudis, with a wooden post for his opponent. More experienced fighters trained against each other, but their weapons were still blunted. These were not only valuable but dangerous men. They were only issued sharpened weapons when they reached the Colosseum. The gladiators entered the arena through the Gate of Life, the Porta Sanevivaria. Gladiators defended themselves with shields, their swords too brittle to deflect direct attacks. A broken sword meant almost certain defeat. Each fighter was given a ranking. The highest ranked had huge status and market value. Some of the fighters were sold for the equivalent of £160,000. Betting on fights was a passion second only to watching the spectacle. Fight statistics were obsessively recorded and argued over by fans. Experienced fighters were often matched against novices to improve their victory tally and value. Medals and laurel wreaths were bestowed on the champions. Even when vanquished, a gladiator might stand a chance of overcoming death if he had impressed the emperor with his skill and courage. A gladiator would plead for mercy by raising his hand. The baying crowd often influenced the emperor's decision. Sparing a crowd's favorite was good public relations.
The truth is, no one knows whether the Romans put their thumbs up or their thumbs down. We know they put them in one direction, and everyone knew what the meaning was. But we use it as a term of convention. Thumbs up, survive. Thumbs down, death.
Slaves dressed as Charon, the demon of death, used a ceremonial hammer to dispatch any vanquished gladiators showing signs of life. For a society obsessed with conquest and virility, there was no honor in defeat. Victory, however, promised great rewards. The most successful gladiators won their freedom from slavery and were rewarded a ceremonial wooden practice sword that signified their liberation. Amazingly, many chose to return to the arena, unable to resist the thrill of the fight, the fame, and their status as sex symbols.
The Latin word gladius means sword, and so the gladiator is a swordsman. But gladius also means, colloquially, penis. And so they were sex symbols. Celitus, which means crowds roar, or someone, the netter of young girls by night, they were seen as people with virility.
This heady combination of sex and violence pervaded Roman society. Only a few were brave enough to criticize the established views. Saint Augustine, the great Christian thinker, described the reaction of one of his students attending the games.
When he saw the blood, it was as though he had drunk a deep draught of savage passion. Instead of turning away, he fixed his eyes upon the scene and drank in all its frenzy, unaware of what he was doing. He reveled in the wickedness of fighting and was drunk with the fascination of bloodshed. When he left the arena, he carried away with him a diseased mind which would leave him no peace until he came back again. No longer as one of the group which had first dragged him there, but as their leader, taking new sheep to the slaughter.
Scholars have estimated that more than 700,000 people perished in the Colosseum. Gladiators, criminals, soldiers, ordinary men, women, and even children were condemned. All died publicly, their bodies carried through the gates of the grandest arena in the Roman Empire, just to keep the masses entertained. But this spectacle of death could not last forever. Nearly 2,000 years after its inauguration, the Colosseum still attracts 2 million visitors every year, the crowd still drawn by its grandeur and chilling reputation. The ruins that capture their imagination, ravaged by earthquake and architectural looting, represent only 33% of the Colosseum's original size. "500,000 tons of travertine rock, bound together by 300 tons of wrought iron, created its imperious facade and interior strength. Today, the raw materials to build the Colosseum would cost £200 million. Add to that the costs of labor and transport, and the total is closer to £500 million. While the empire flourished, so too did the Colosseum. 42 emperors exploited the arena to win favor with the masses, each in turn striving to outdo his predecessor.
I think there's a comparison between what the emperors try to do with outdoing each other with the most amazing games and sort of the way the studios try to come up with the greatest blockbuster, the most amazingly affected movie. I know that when Trajan got back from his Dacian Wars, he had spectacular games that went on for a long time. About 5,000 exotic animals, I think, were slaughtered, and he probably outdid just about everyone of his day.
But the fate of the empire and the Colosseum were inextricably linked. When the empire declined and revenues from the dominions dried up, the financial burden of the games grew heavier. In contrast, Christianity flourished, even though persecution of the new religion was widespread and brutal. Many died in the Colosseum's arena itself, but martyrdom only strengthened the faith. Saint Ignatius, one of the first Christian martyrs to die here, wrote before reaching the Colosseum,
"The whole way from Syria to Rome, chained as I am to 60 soldiers who only grow more insolent the more bribes they are given, how I look forward to the real lions that have been prepared for me. All I pray is that I will find them swift. I am going to make overtures to them so that they may devour me with all speed.
The young religion and its followers turned their backs on the bloodletting of pagan Rome. The voices of dissent grew in number and volume, challenging the certainties that had made the Colosseum the heart of Roman culture. Today, a cross commemorates the Christian martyrs who died here, but their greatest tribute may be their contribution to the demise of the Colosseum and the Games.
No one really knows why the game stopped, but in the 4th century, the Romans had to defend the empire against a huge onslaught of Persians on the one hand and barbarians on the other, and it must have been very difficult in those circumstances to get the same level of munificence as before. And in addition, the empire had become Christian, and although Christian emperors celebrated wild beast hunts and gladiatorial games for a good 100 years, eventually Christian monks objected to the celebration of gladiatorial games, killing of other humans.
In 404 AD, a monk called Telemachus leapt into the arena of the Colosseum in an attempt to separate two gladiators. In a frenzy of outrage, the crowd tore him to death. But now the Roman elite had converted to Christianity, and within days, gladiatorial combat was banned by the Christian emperor Honorius. The slaughter of wild beasts continued for a century longer, but the signs of terminal decay were glaring. The correspondence of Quintus Symmachus, the prefect of Rome, reveals the sordid reality of the Colosseum's final years.
Now, at the very moment of the games, we're without bears. We have received some poor bear cubs, worn out and weary, and as for the lions, we won't speak about them. Our crocodiles are wasting away because they've been on a persistent hunger strike for 50 days. 2 of them, which are still breathing, we will keep until you come, although their refusal to eat does not guarantee that they will be able to survive for long.
Even the import of wild beasts was a luxury the impoverished empire could no longer afford. Indeed, the excesses of the Colosseum had driven many species to the point of extinction. The games that had been a celebration of Rome's power and glory now reflected its demise. They were underfunded, outdated, and at odds with the new Christian morality. In 410, Rome fell to barbarian invaders from the north, and the Colosseum fell with it. The People's Palace and the empire it had served proved to be as inseparable in their decline as they had been in their triumph. For the next 1,000 years, the Colosseum was plundered by successive generations of metal merchants and stonemasons. Yet these ghostly remains still fascinate us. They're a chilling epitaph to the Western world's greatest and most brutal empire. The memories of the Colosseum's spectacles and of the thousands who died here in the name of entertainment live on in our imagination.